everybody for joining us on Monday. Thanks for your patience in getting going. Technical problems are not uncommon. Anyway, welcome to meeting number 31 of the Standing Committee on Natural Resources, Low Carbon and Renewable Fuels in Canada. We have three witnesses here today, and I should like to welcome Mr. Brunel Duceppe, who's here for Mr. Simard, so thank you for joining us. Our three witnesses, we have Dr. Marc Jacquard from Simon Fraser University, from Hydrogen Canada, Cyril Defus-Sansot, who's the president, and Transition Accelerator, Dr. David Lazelle, who is in 40 centimeters of snow, I'm told, in Banff today. Anyway, welcome all three of you. So each of you will be given up to 5 minutes to make your opening remarks. Following that, we'll open the floor to questions from the members. You can speak and are encouraged to speak in either or both official languages. You have translation available at the bottom of your screen. If there's any problems, please let us know. 5 minutes is a hard stop for your opening remarks, and then each of the members have time limits as well. So I will start with Dr. Jacquard. How are you?
Hello, welcome, and thanks for inviting me. I'll get going. In my remarks, I focus on two challenges related to your study. Because of the tendency of some people to let perfection be the enemy of good, you may have heard strongly negative statements about biofuels and biofuel regulations, but I caution you to discount such extreme positions because evidence supports a more nuanced view. And I explain things like this in my my latest book, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success, Overcoming Myths That Hinder Progress. And that's the kind of focus that I bring to your committee today. It's actually a simple challenge that we have and a simple solution. We have to use carbon pricing and regulations to replace the open burning of coal, oil, and natural gas. And it could be with renewable energy, some nuclear power, and even still using fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. I focus the first part of my remarks on false negative claims about emissions of liquid biofuels. In my 30 years working on the energy transition, I've encountered some extremely negative views on biofuels. And even if unintended, these can help people who would keep us on a fossil fuel burning path. One hears that consuming biofuels won't reduce greenhouse gas emissions because burning biomass releases CO2. And it's true that if we permanently transform a forest into a desert to make biofuels, this conversion will lead to an increase in atmospheric CO2 emissions. But if we produce the biomass for biofuels from sustainable forestry or agriculture, there's no net increase in atmospheric CO2. And this is not my personal view, it's the view of the Independent Scientific Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. One also hears that even if biomass can be zero emission source of energy, it's the production processes of converting it into biofuels that causes CO2 emissions. People refer to this as a life cycle analysis, looking at the emissions in the growing, harvesting, transporting, and processing of the biomass feedstocks that we use to make biofuels. However, again, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change argues that this static life cycle analysis approach is wrong. Biofuels can be produced using organic fertilizers and with farm equipment, transport vehicles, and biofuel processing plants that are powered by sustainably produced biofuels. Life cycle emissions from the production of biofuels will be near zero when we implement policies that require it. One also, so we can get a contribution from biofuels that might be, I don't know, 15, 20% replacement of the liquid fuels that we're currently using in transportation. It's not the solution, but it can be part of that solution. This modest contribution, in fact, can be critically important. Biomass feedstocks then would come from forest and agricultural organic waste, sustainably managed forest plantations, converted marginal agricultural lands, and some sustainable agricultural production that improves income and employment opportunities in our rural regions as part of the energy transition. Now, I focus the last part of my remarks, or as long as I can go, on false negative claims about biofuel regulations. I'm an economist. I know that humanity could achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions with just one economically efficient policy, a carbon tax. It's technically and administratively possible to apply this one policy and keep it rising until emissions fall to zero. But a singular reliance on carbon tax is politically difficult. And we all know all about that. And I talk about it in chapter 6 of my book. And that's why leading jurisdictions like California significantly rely on regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we economists can be fine with this because a well-designed regulation can perform like a carbon tax. And I'll give you one quick example. To get to zero emissions in 2050, we must phase out the burning of fossil fuel diesel trucks. But we don't know if trucks in 2050 will mostly use electricity or hydrogen or biodiesel. And we don't want government policy to send us down what ends up being the more expensive path. But guess what? If government implements a regulation that requires a rising blend of zero emission biodiesel in regular diesel, such that by 2050, the only diesel available for sale is 100% biodiesel, government has not picked the technology energy winner. The regulation has simply reached a level of stringency that bans fossil fuel burning trucks, which is the same outcome as a rising carbon tax. Under both policies, the future relative market shares in 2050 of electric trucks or hydrogen trucks or biodiesel trucks will be determined by their relative costs and the preferences of trucking firms. The regulation is technology neutral. And so I'm going to end there with those two main points. One, that be careful of blanket statements about biofuels being bad. It all depends on how we decide to produce them. Thank you. I'm done. Thanks for your attention.
I appreciate that. Okay, hydrogen. Am I pronouncing that? Hydrogen, yes. That's a tongue twister, but you're next for 5 minutes.
Oui, tout à fait. Vous avez...
Thank you very much, and you did pronounce my name correctly. Thank you for inviting us to present our vision on clean fuel and the way we want to address this market. A reminder about our company, Hydrogen, and its Quebec branch. We want to produce green hydrogen from renewable electricity and increase the use of green hydrogen in a global fashion. However, the logistics related to the transportation of green hydrogen continues to be very expensive. The idea is to produce clean fuels from green hydrogen to benefit from the logistics already in place for these commodities to deploy massively worldwide the production of green hydrogen. And that is why today, on the margins of methanol, ethanol, and other biofuels, I want to draw your attention to green ammonia. Often, ammonia is deemed to be a main input into fertilizers, for instance, but green ammonia is also a fuel, a very efficient fuel, because in the 1950s, it was a fuel that enabled the first planes to fly, and it is a fuel that's manufactured with hydrogen. So conventionally, hydrogen with fossil fuels, basically a natural gas. But the vision that we have is to use renewable energy not only to capture green nitrogen, but also to use water electrolysis and produce green hydrogen. But because it's a fuel, it is of interest to sectors that are in huge demand of fuel, especially maritime transport. And one of the investors in our company is Trafigura. And it promotes, does a lot of lobbying with international maritime transportation to try to encourage the sector to go towards clean fuels by putting in place bonus systems for instance, carbon taxing to promote green fuels such as ammonia. It is one of the most promising for maritime transport. And by establishing where we have access to renewable fuel that is accessible cheaply, we produce huge volumes of ammonia to justify the implementation of a production of green hydrogen, which ultimately in a very economic way, because if you're talking about massive imports, you want to benefit from economies of scale. So you could produce green hydrogen as a replacement of classic fuels, as well as renewable fuels that will have enabled a transition. Now, in the decision-making related to regulations on clean fuels, we feel that green ammonia should not be forgotten because it can use for the same uses as the traditional clean fuels. In Canada and Quebec, we have a first project of some 250 megawatts for water electrolysis for the use of this ammonia, and we'll slowly transform the use of these fuels so that within some 15 years, we'll be able to use green hydrogen, and it will have benefit from the amortization we'll have put in place. And it should be used eventually for maritime as well as land transport, but even aviation. In fact, hydrogen-fueled planes are already under development. So that is the message I wanted to convey to you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Right on time. Always appreciate it. Okay, and last we have Dr. Lazell. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here today. Low carbon fuels have been a major focus of my academic career for more than 20 years. Over the past 2 years, I've been helping to launch the Transition Accelerator, a pan-Canadian nonprofit that is focused on achieving net zero emissions energy systems in a way that creates jobs and stimulates the economy. There is a rapidly growing global consensus that to achieve net zero emissions, virtually all carbon-based energy carriers like gasoline, diesel, natural gas must be replaced with zero-emission energy carriers like electricity and hydrogen. And of course, these energy carriers must be made with little or no greenhouse gas emissions. This might sound like bad news for Canada, but it is not. Canada is internationally renowned as one of the world's lowest cost producers of low and zero carbon electricity and hydrogen. Electricity is an excellent energy carrier for personally owned vehicles, for light duty transportation, and for space heating in more moderate climates. However, I want to focus today on hydrogen as the net zero fuel of choice for heavy duty and long distance transport, essentially those markets that are now served by diesel, for space heating, especially in cold climates and for large buildings, and in heavy industries such as steelmaking. By 2050, hydrogen could deliver 30% of the secondary energy demand in Canada and feed a major energy export industry, while adding about $100 billion a year to the Canadian economy and delivering somewhere between 25 and 50% reductions in national greenhouse gas emissions. When hydrogen is made from the electrolysis of water with renewables or nuclear energy, it is often called green hydrogen. On the other hand, blue hydrogen is made from fossil fuels like natural gas, when byproduct CO2 is captured and sequestered in geological reservoirs. Both green and blue hydrogen are low carbon, and both will reduce life cycle emissions by 90% or more when displacing diesel in use in heavy transport. Now, some provinces are better positioned to make green hydrogen, while others are better positioned to make blue. Either way, hydrogen could provide a shared pan-Canadian vision for a clean energy future. This is a rare opportunity for this country. The challenge with hydrogen is it is a gas. So it is more expensive to transport and store than liquid fuels like diesel or gasoline. Canada can actually make low carbon hydrogen at about half the wholesale cost of diesel fuel. However, getting the hydrogen to market is only cost effective if it is done at large scale, serving dozens, hundreds, and thousands of users. So how do we get there from here? I've got 4 points I want to make. Number one is focus on the entire value chain, looking at both policies and public funding to build new energy systems in a coordinated way. Number two, understand the level of ambition that is required. Every year, there are over 5,000 buses and 34,000 heavy-duty trucks sold in Canada. To put Canada on a transition path to net zero, 1/3 of these, or 13,000 vehicles per year, would need to be hydrogen fueled by 2030. This is a challenge since such vehicles, these large vehicles of this type, will not arrive in Canada until 2022. Number three, early investments are needed in pilots and demonstration projects for vehicles, fueling stations, and low carbon hydrogen production. These are important to stimulate interest and build confidence in a new hydrogen value chain. And finally, number four is to concentrate investments on hydrogen hubs. Over the next 5 to 7 years, substantial public investments must be focused on a limited number of regions that can build together low-cost hydrogen supply, efficient transport, and substantial demand. In conclusion, hydrogen is an essential energy carrier in a net zero energy future. Canada is well positioned to take a leadership role, but we must act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Okay, so we'll move into our first round of questions, 6 minutes each. And Mr. McLean, I understand that you are going to go first.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and great panel here today on the issues in front of us. And thank you very much, gentlemen, for appearing here before us today. First question is going to go to Mr. Jacquard on his statement about he made the reference to the blanket statements of biofuels being bad. Mr. Jacquard, I appreciate you're an economist. Have you seen the analysis done by Thunder Said Energy, a group out of the UK, which indicates that the life cycle carbon footprint of biofuels is approximately twice that of the fuels it replaces?
No, I have not seen that study. I have seen many studies that have claimed that over the last 20 years. And that was the point of my opening comments, because I can look at that study too. And I've known from the 20 or 30 I've seen before that people have done this using a static analysis. And that's what I was referring to. It's not how are we doing it when we don't regulate the emissions produced when using biofuels, to what is possible. So if we're talking about hydrogen or ammonia, we're talking about how do you regulate something. Dr. Lazelle's comments about producing hydrogen from natural gas involves regulations so that you don't do it the way we are now. So my point of my comments are, if you regulate it, if you regulate the life cycle emissions, what can be the production? And I've seen lots of data of cases where biofuels are made with zero emissions life cycle.
Okay, we haven't seen that actually. We've actually seen a whole bunch of contrary evidence. But let me ask you even further here, if we go down this path, if you think about a static supply or a growing supply of biomass being used for consumption of food in the world, the consumption of biofuels is going to require, as in canola, a diversion of that fuel or that foodstuff, biomass, towards fuel production. Now, how do you justify that that's not going to require more land mass as a result?
Yeah, so the studies, I've done a study for all of Canada, in fact, and I'll make it available to the committee. I did it a few years ago. And what I said in my statements was, here's the processes you would follow. This is what Scandinavia is doing right now. You would make sure that it's sustainable forestry and you're using forest waste. You make sure you're using agricultural wastes. You make sure you're converting marginal lands.
No, but Mr. Those are biogases in many respects. Those aren't biofuels. We're talking about creating biofuels here from fresh stock in many respects to kind of get there. Now, the biofuels industry itself understands it takes 1.6 units of power to create 1 unit of power to come out the other end. And that, of course, is clean, as we define it, versus hydrocarbon energy. So how does that actually square up as being energy efficient at the end of the day and not creating more actual greenhouse gases? As you say, the 30 studies you've read have shown.
So these are all static analysis, and it sounds to me like you're giving static analysis as well. It sounds to me like you're refusing to look at some of the ways in which we are producing biofuels. And I'm looking at Scandinavia, but I'm also looking at Scandinavia making agreements with people who are providing the biofuels. I'm also looking at Brazil. I'm looking at many cases where we can make.
Sorry, Mr. Jakar, we're talking about production here. We're not talking about deals. We're talking about actually the CO2 production from biofuels. But I'm going to move on, and thank you for your input. I'm going to move on to hydrogen because I'm interested in green hydrogen. And I'm interested in the environmental footprint of green hydrogen and actually kind of steam methane reforming versus electrolysis. Electrolysis is obviously much more, energy intensive, if you will, at the end of the day. Can you tell us about the overall environmental footprint of electrolysis versus steam methane reforming, please, Mr. Dufault-Sanso?
If you consider water electrolysis from non-renewable electricity, you have to take into account the energy performance, which would be lower when compared to reforming metal. That's why I do not promote water electricity from non-renewable electricity. But if you examine production that is 100% renewable electricity, then you would have a low environmental impact. Regardless of the performance, you're talking about renewable electricity. It is available. You just need to capture it. So, say a wind farm or sun panels. I mean, if you
and that's got a recent study here from Bank of Montreal Capital Markets, actually. And it does say that electrolysis uses twice as much water and 5 to 6 times more energy than steam methane reforming as green hydrogen. We accept that we're going to need all kinds of hydrogen going forward here. What we want to is make sure that we understand is the carbon footprint of each of these going forward. With 5 to 6 times more energy required in electrolysis versus steam methane reforming, it does seem to indicate that the actual CO2 emissions can be higher. And you're exactly right. The power from wind and nuclear and hydro are the lowest footprint, but still you've got a lot of energy here that translates in the end into a lot of CO2. Do you know this analysis?
Electrolysis does not emit CO2, contrary to reforming of natural gas. When you break down a gas molecule, the carbon in the gas ends up in the atmosphere, but when you break down a water molecule with electricity, there's no carbon, there's no CO2 emissions. So yes, it consumes a lot of hydro, but the reforming process is also energy consuming because you lose the energy in the natural gas itself by breaking down the molecule, and you only capture the hydrogen energy. So I think it's a false debate to oppose the two so directly.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. McLean. On to you, Mr. Lefebvre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci à tous nos
Thank you to all our witnesses this morning. It really is very interesting to hear from you because this is a topic is a big concern to us.
Dr. Lizelle, you talked about certainly what we need to do with the value chain, being ambitious, early investments in creating these hubs. Then you said we must act now. So I think some of the big items that you're talking about, certainly the top 4 things that we need to do. But for the purpose of our report, what we like to have sometimes is actually specific, granular suggestions as to how we accomplish all of these, right? What can the federal government do to act now to ensure that Canada, we have a chance to be world leaders in the sector, to take advantage of these opportunities? Because you talk about these financial opportunities and this transition, because that's the name of the company or of the group you're with, Transition Accelerator. So this is very important to our country. So I want to hear you more in depth, if you can, in about a minute. Get really specific with us as to what you would want to see the federal government do to really help to accelerate this transition.
Well, certainly, and I think the Canadian hydrogen strategy that came out just before Christmas, I think identifies a lot of very specific recommendations, and we certainly had a lot of input into that. We weren't the authors of it, so I would point you to that. In terms of specific things that are needed, I would argue we need to start getting out there and running pilots for hydrogen, for both green and blue hydrogen production in concentrated areas where we need vehicles to be bringing in hydrogen using vehicles, especially in the heavy duty fleet, in buses and heavy trucks, and getting them tried out, putting them through the paces, see how they operate under Canadian conditions. We need to be doing the kind of detailed techno-economic analyses that basically start to design a new energy system that will actually be capable of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And it's obviously complex. We're talking about building a new energy system essentially from scratch, and we want to not see a lot of stranded assets. So we want to actually figure out, how do we go from the complex energy systems we have today, carbon-based, to carbon-free energy systems. Both with different green and blue hydrogen production, but a whole new value chains, and we have to figure out how to build those, and so resources are needed in order to make this happen both in demonstrations and in hydrogen hubs.
Thank you all. Maybe let Mr. Jacquard maybe talk about that as well. And I'm interested as well, Mr. Jacquard, on this whole notion that which you raised about static analysis versus, I guess, fluid analysis, because I think it's very important that we have that in our report because there certainly is, there's a mindset, or certainly there's an opinion out there. It's certainly an opinion that, it's just as expensive to create one or create the other, and the effect of greenhouse gas emission is the same. So I'd like to hear you on certainly the opportunities and on the static analysis piece that you mentioned.
Oh, thank you. So the economist in me is neutral in terms of the points about hydrogen, how it's made, where it comes from, what its potential is, especially in transportation, of course, and likewise for electricity. So I still am of the opinion that we should make sure not to pick the winner. But of course, government does, and hopefully your report talks about how government might create conditions that are actually favoring certain things. And David Lizelle talks about how if we're going to have hydrogen, we need to do some of those. The government needs to step in, and I agree with him. But my point is simply that if you're getting to zero emission, the world gets a lot simpler, because it means not only in the end use combustion of something are you thinking about CO2 and is it in a closed loop, however you're getting it, but you have to think about the entire production process. And the point I was making was just to give you an example, in British Columbia, we have a low carbon fuel standard. So it's where people can sell in and trade credits for how they're reducing the life cycle carbon intensity of fuels, ethanol, diesel, that are used in transportation. And if you look at the charts, you see producers who are ranked to be net zero in their life cycle emissions. And so my point is simply that our policies have to be right across the economy. And then when you do that, you will produce some ethanol and you'll produce some biodiesel, and they will be zero emission life cycle. What will be their cost compared to life cycle zero emission hydrogen and life cycle zero emission electricity, depending on the end use? I don't know who will win. I do know that in Scandinavia right now, 20% of liquid fuels are from a biogenic origin, and some of it's imported and some of it's produced locally, and some of it is really focused on having zero life cycle emissions. So it's that policy you need, and then I don't worry so much about the outcome.
Okay, so very quickly on the policy in Scandinavia, certainly, is there any lessons to be learned there of how they got to 20%?
Oh, yes. I mean, it was, they have a very large carbon tax, but they've also picked certain sectors as well. So government has said, oh, intercity busing, we're going to help make sure that we have E85 produced for those buses, and those are the ones that we're going to hire, we're going to pick as our fleet. So it's a combination, as I say, of government being directive, even in its investments and choices, but also putting, and they have regulations as well. So regulations and pricing, I mean, it's the basic formula that we know. And at least in Canada federally, and in British Columbia, where I'm from, and in Quebec, we're doing those kinds of things.
Thanks, Mr. Lefebvre. Okay, Mr. Brunel Desapp, you're next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. This discussion is extremely important, as well as interesting, and thanks to the witnesses for your testimony. I'm going to try to ask each of you a question if I have time to do so. I'll begin by Mr. Desailles. I believe I heard you say in your statement, and I liked it, you talked about the different coloured hydrogen. The Canadian strategy for hydrogen has as its purpose to encourage the development and deployment of hydrogen, stimulate short-term investments, and to elaborate new regulatory measures to attain zero emission targets by 2050. But as you said, to achieve those targets, it might well be important to distinguish the different sources of hydrogen, gray, blue, green, because maybe the gray, for instance, is just one step. I wonder, how should this strategy be developed to foster especially green hydrogen? Thank you.
Yes, I think that we should preferably get away from the colors and focus on the carbon intensity. That's the factor that we want. We want low life cycle carbon intensity. And I would argue that, and this is happening around the world, standards are being developed and defined for the carbon intensity of hydrogen. And Canada should insist that carbon intensity has to be, life cycle carbon emissions have to be below a certain level. There is a European study, it's called Certify with a big HY at the end of it, that has identified, I think it's 36.4 grams of CO2 per megajoule lower heat value hydrogen, and that is the maximum carbon intensity. I think that's a good place to start, and I think we need to even lower that carbon intensity that we allow from a life cycle basis as years go on, as we move towards 2050. Green electricity made from wind or solar or large hydro can meet that standard. So can blue electricity made from steam methane reforming or autothermal reforming with carbon capture and storage. So I think what we need to do is to set a standard. The Canadian Standards Association is looking at this now, and there is an international committee. So I think Canada should be encouraging that and coming out with a standard for the quality, similar to what has been talked about for biofuels, for low carbon emissions on biofuels. I think that's critical.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leisel, for that answer. And now I'd like to turn to Mr. Dufour-Sanzo. Have I pronounced your name properly? Sanso, sorry. Without water, you wouldn't be able to do electrolysis. Now, we welcomed one witness to our committee who said we should associate a price to the molecule. So we should monitor its footprint throughout the life cycle. So it would That way we could arrive at cleaner fuels. What is your thinking about what I've just mentioned? I do agree with the principle, but I'd like to provide some detail. There are two ways of promoting a clean molecule. The first is to support its green character through subsidies. I mean, the cleaner, the higher the subsidy. The massification, if I can say so, of green hydrogen in particular will, thanks to economies of scale, eventually mean we don't need the subsidies. If you multiply the number of plants, you will lower costs. So if you have renewable energy that develops for making those kinds of machines work, you could end up with an economic model that would be comparable with clean fuels. The thing is to get away from fossil fuels. Now, with a carbon tax or a bonus malus system, whereas those who use clean carbons will get bonuses and those who don't will be penalized. This is something that needs to regulate the market so that we can arrive to solutions with the lowest carbon intensity. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to Mr. Jacquard. I know that you did not want to, talk too much about government strategy as an economist, but you do have an opinion on certain issues, I assume. People from the department say they make no distinction between the hydrogen colors in their strategy. Essentially, the objective is to favor the development of the hydrogen market, all types of hydrogen. So once you've stimulated demand, you can then aim towards, a low life cycle carbon intensity. What do you think of that? You or someone is envisaging 2 stages. Is that it? I mean, one to promote hydrogen and then a second stage to be careful about emissions in the production cycle. And if that's the idea, I would say no, because it would oblige. What you need in place is policies right from the start, ones that would send a signal to the markets and investors to go in the right direction. We talked about carbon taxes and subsidies, and most recently a clean fuel standard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Cannings, over to you.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. It's as usual, it's been a very interesting discussion so far. I'm just going to continue on with Mr. Jacquard to let him perhaps go more on that. I was going to ask you about the mix of the carbon pricing and regulations that you talked about. You used the example of biofuels and how we needed that, the regulations to get us to 100% biofuels when we're talking about diesel, for instance. But I assume that carbon pricing also plays a part in that, as the carbon pricing on biofuels would be much lower, and the same goes for hydrogen or green electricity. You would have regulations perhaps about the number of hydrogen vehicles versus the push from the carbon pricing as well. I just wanted to give you some more time to fill in on that.
Thank you, and I'll be quite brief. One of the things, so I'm always making a distinction, I did in my comments, about the actions. That's us switching away from high emission end use or production processes of any energy form that we use. That's the action. What is the policy that drives that? And we're told that you have to have carbon pricing, and an economist like me, I say that, but actually you don't have to. You can do it entirely with regulations. We did that with ozone depleting chlorofluorocarbons. So you can do it all with regulation. So I talked in my comments about having a rising carbon price, and it'll get to a point where you'd be at zero emissions in both the end use and the production of anything, whether it's hydrogen or ammonia or biodiesel or whatever. But if you're going to do it with a regulation, you can do that as well. And so that was my point. And so for your committee, in British Columbia, I talked about a low carbon fuel standard that we copied from California. I've been involved in the federal process over the last almost 5 years, I guess, of the design of a clean fuel standard. I didn't like how it was initially designed. I thought it should narrow in on liquid fuels. And what it does is it regulates both the fuel end use as defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is why I mentioned that, and the production process. And it would look at the production process of hydrogen, of electricity, of biofuels. So I'm simply saying, do that kind of regulation if you don't want to do carbon pricing. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to move to Mr. Lazelle now and talk about hydrogen. You mentioned the possibility of an export market for hydrogen, especially green hydrogen in Canada. When I've talked to the energy ministers from countries like Germany, Japan, they're very big on export markets or importing hydrogen from other countries that have a clean source of hydrogen. Germany, I remember using an example of, say, a big mega solar project in Chile, and using that to produce hydrogen to move that clean energy around the world. Just wondering if you could expand on that idea of a possible export market for Canadian hydrogen.
I think it's actually quite a large market, potentially equal in size in our calculations to the domestic market that we have for hydrogen. Just as today we export an amount of oil that's equal to all the oil we consume in Canada. The hydrogen could be exported as liquid hydrogen or compressed hydrogen, but probably most critically, as Mr. Dufault-Sansot talked about, is exporting it as ammonia. The hydrogen could be produced either from blue or green hydrogen, converted to ammonia to be put on a ship and ships overseas, or if it's being exported to the United States in a hydrogen pipeline. So there are different alternatives. There are a couple other technologies as well, but certainly there's a lot of interest on Western Canada, in South Korea and Japan. And in fact, we're in quite common or regular conversations with companies that would like to import hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen from Canada.
And could that link in with Canada's expertise in hydrogen fuel cells?
Absolutely.
Producing those fuel cells here in Canada and exporting that?
We could certainly export fuel cells. We can, in terms of attracting international investment, there's a lot of companies around the world that are interested in making hydrogen vehicles. We're not we make fuel cells, and those fuel cells could go into those vehicles. And so we may actually be able to attract manufacturing industries within Canada that are actually creating the vehicles that would be used here, and also attract foreign investment to produce the hydrogen for export.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, how much?
Vote 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll just ask again, Mr. Lazelle, you talked about hubs, investing in hydrogen hubs. We've heard that from other witnesses. Perhaps your ideas on how the government could help in creating those hubs.
Well, I think one of the things is to define the characteristic of what makes a viable hub. Our focus in what we're doing is looking at making sure any public investment is focused on capital investment, not operational investment. So when the public investment stops, one has an economically viable energy system that will keep running. And I think that's really the metric we would argue that needs to be looked at when looking at public investment in hubs.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Cannings. Okay, we'll move into round two for 5 minutes each, starting with Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. My first question, Mr. Lazell. The end goal of this entire process is to mitigate the effects of climate change. So everything we're doing is leading to that end. But sometimes I think we get too focused on the goal of achieving net zero carbon emissions while possibly ignoring the consequences of emissions of other, greenhouse gases of varying levels. Now, I've read in some places, water vapor is a significant greenhouse gas. Water vapor is a byproduct of the combustion of hydrogen, and that hydrogen, even in its gaseous form, if it were to escape, also does have some impact on the climate as well. I was wondering, what's the evidence around that? Is there an impact?
When you look at climate change, it's about how long the gas lasts in the atmosphere. And certainly burning hydrogen, burning fossil fuels, all puts water into the atmosphere. But the time for water in the atmosphere is about 2 to 3 weeks, and then it rains out. What we're talking about with CO2 emissions is they're lasting there for over 100 years.
And what about hydrogen gas in and of itself? Like if it wasn't combusted and much like methane escaped into the atmosphere, is there any consequences to that?
Yes, it's actually quite interesting. I studied that 20 years ago, quite a bit to work on that. Hydrogen is actually pulled back out of the atmosphere by soil microorganisms.
Okay.
So essentially, the hydrogen has it's exists in only 0.5 part per million in the atmosphere. And when you double hydrogen in the atmosphere, the biology of the biological soils around the world will stimulate the microbial activity and pull the hydrogen back out. So effectively, the work that was done 20 years ago suggested that there's very little, certainly very little problem with some hydrogen emissions, and the biological systems will self-regulate and feedback.
That's positive to hear, and it's good to have that information on the record. I found you're talking about green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, and Canada is a diverse country, as you know. We have provinces like Quebec, British Columbia, who have ample, and Manitoba, ample hydroelectric resources and fairly cheap and steady power sources. But then you get to provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where we're much more electrification was coal and now natural gas. Do you think it would be better for the government to approach this regionally? Green hydrogen obviously has more economic benefits in provinces like Quebec and BC, but in Western provinces, it seems blue hydrogen would be the more viable option. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that we should let the market decide, but also there's some of the producers of blue hydrogen are looking for some subsidies for carbon capture and storage. I would argue you need to go and look at the green hydrogen and say, let's make sure we haven't tilted the playing field against green. I think both are extremely important. We need both. The blue hydrogen is lower cost at the present time, but green hydrogen prices are coming down. So my sense is we don't need to decide. We let the market determine which works. And the problem is moving hydrogen around. And so you're going to produce, you obviously want to produce it, close to where it's going to be used if you can. So that's going to have a regional opportunity.
Now, this leads me into my next question. Canada has a lot of existing legacy oil and gas infrastructure. What do you think the role of this infrastructure and the workers who build and maintain this infrastructure will be in a hydrogen future? Is that something that can be melded together?
I think what we're looking at here is an opportunity to piggyback on some of our existing infrastructure. We already make today across Canada, mostly from natural gas, about 8,000 tons of hydrogen every day. And so we can actually piggyback off of that to pull off, first of all, get the companies to start making that as blue hydrogen instead of gray hydrogen, which the carbon pricing that Mark's talked about actually really is helping to do that. Second, we can take a pipeline off that and distribute a portion of that hydrogen instead of being used as an industrial feedstock the way it is now. That same hydrogen could be used as a fuel.
Now, can that hydrogen be blended with the crude or the bitumen in and then separate it at a later stage so that you could run bitumen and hydrogen in the same pipelines at the same time?
No, not really blended in terms of with oil, but blended with gas is a possibility, with natural gas. So you can put the hydrogen into sort of distribution networks to decarbonize natural gas. The economics of that isn't as good.
Yeah, ATCO I think is trying that in my area.
Thanks, Mr. Lloyd.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Over to you, Mr. Weiler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just thank you to all the witnesses today. Really, really interesting testimony already. I want to pick up on something that my colleague was just mentioning here. And I think there's a wide understanding out there that we're going to need biofuels and hydrogen to decarbonize some of the hardest to abate areas like freight, shipping, and others. But one area that it's a little less clear on is buildings, where in much of the country we have existing infrastructure to deliver natural gas. And which actually this is one of our largest sources of emissions in our country. So my question to both, maybe first to Dr. Jacquard and then to Dr. Lysell, in your opinions, are we better placed to introduce low carbon fuels into this existing infrastructure, or are we better placed to electrify? If we're focused on measures that are both most economically palatable to the consumer and which will create jobs along the way.
So again, you would either continue to have a rising carbon price, and then you'd find out if biomethane slowly blending out of natural gas or some combination of that and blue or green hydrogen coming into those pipes, if that was the solution, or if it was more people using electric heat pumps and even waste heat, but electric heat pumps, ground source probably in the colder in much of the country. But the policy is you either have a rising carbon price, or you can do what I just described for liquid fuels. And in fact, I'm involved in the Climate Solutions Council in British Columbia, where I'm pretty sure I'm safe to say this has been public now, that we're working on a regulation for gas in pipes that is similar to the kind of regulation that I've just been talking about with clean fuel. So what it does is it says, we know that you can't be using fossil fuel derived natural gas in our buildings. And so we're going to phase out the content of that in any kind of gas that's delivered by pipe to buildings over a 20, 30-year time period. And when we do that, two possible, as I say, then the market will decide if actually biomethane or some mixture with clean hydrogen is what we start using in buildings increasingly, or if we move more to electricity. And I think we shouldn't care which one we do, just get the right policy in place.
Thank you, Dr. Jacquard. Same question to Dr. Lysell.
Yeah, I would tend to agree largely with what Mark said, although I think we also have to look at the capability of actually what's capable that we can achieve. For example, if we're going to move to electricity, and especially in colder regions of Canada, when it gets below heat pumps, for example, our electricity-driven heat pumps that move heat from outside to inside in the winter, once it gets below about 15 degrees below 0 Celsius, those heat pumps basically don't work very well, right? And then you have this huge electricity demand in one season of the year. And how do you actually create the electricity in the winter? And when you don't even have, we have short days, you don't have solar, and you often have a lack of wind resource in the middle of winter. So the renewable, you have a mismatch, and you have a real problem with energy storage and distribution if you're using electricity. We've done a fair number of analyses of this, and our analyses for many parts of Canada, it's pretty clear that we're going to have a real problem in our new energy system, a net zero energy system, if we try to move it to electricity for space heating. So we have an infrastructure already, a natural gas infrastructure. Our recommendations is really start to look at slowly converting that infrastructure to more hydrogen. The economics, when you get to about $170 a ton of CO2, which we're talking about, all of a sudden the price of natural gas and the price of hydrogen more or less meet, and we could start to see that shift to hydrogen-based fuels for space heating, and you can store hydrogen and move it around more easily than you can electricity in large quantities.
Thank you for that. Much appreciated. Dr. Jacquard, you mentioned carbon tax and flex regs can get us most of the way there, or all the way there rather, to our 2050 target of net zero, and we shouldn't be picking winners. But of course, in Canada, we're living in a globally competitive environment where different counterparts are making significant investments in different low carbon technologies. Hydrogen's certainly one of them, and part of the study is on how do we advance the development of low carbon and renewable fuels domestically as industries. So how do we ensure that we can develop those industries in Canada and not buy them from other countries if we're not going to be picking winners?
Very quickly, if you can, please.
Okay, yes. Well, I mean, I think I partly answered this. It's I earlier agreed with some of David's comments, because when you are going down a path like hydrogen, but even clean zero emission biofuels, government does have a role to play, and I'm not denying that. And I guess the economist in me, though, says find that sweet spot, and that's what I say when I'm making recommendations to government, because we have the energy system has a great history of governments putting all sorts of money into failures, and so you just want to be. What I tried to point out is there's ways to do it where you're letting the market still decide while you're helping out these opportunities. That's my approach.
Thank you. Mr. Smart, I see you're back, so we'll move over to you for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, James. Merci.
Thank you very much, James. Mr. Lazel, earlier it was said during an answer that we should forget the blue color codes, gray, green, blue, and instead focus on the details of the emissions produced in the production of hydrogen. I had read somewhere that producing hydrogen from gas or oil could produce with a ton of hydrogen, you'd end up with about 10 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I'd like to hear you about this, because I'd heard it was not the best strategy to produce hydrogen from gas or oil. So I would like to know, in your opinion, would any gains by producing hydrogen from gas or oil, would the environmental gain be significant?
We've done a lot of analysis of this, and I'm happy to send reports to the committee if they would like. The 10 to 12, which is the life cycle emissions, about 10 to 12 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen, that is gray hydrogen. That is produced from natural gas and just releasing the CO2 into the atmosphere. When that hydrogen is used in a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle to replace diesel, you still get about a 25 to 30, even 40% reduction, depending on the vehicle you're replacing, in greenhouse gas emissions life cycle compared to diesel. Now, what we're saying is that's not enough. If we're going to get and really address climate change, we have to set our target higher. We have to be looking at a lower carbon hydrogen production. And when you're making hydrogen from renewables, from hydro, for example, from solar, or from blue hydrogen from fossil fuels, but you're capturing the CO2 from the fossil fuels and you're sequestering it, the carbon intensity life cycle goes down to around 3, between 1.5 to 3 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And that's kind of the range that I think we need to be setting. And basically have a standard protocol for how do you calculate carbon intensity life cycle. And we're talking about, of course, making the solar panels, putting them on the land, having the land impacts all be considered, making the cement to make a big hydro dam, that has to be considered in the life cycle emissions. And overall, we can get about a 90, even a 95% reduction in emissions relative to the diesel that we're replacing when you follow that whole pathway through. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Smart. Over to you, Mr. Kennings.
Yeah, I'd just like to continue on with Dr. Lazell and talking about those hubs. Just wanted to get a little more information about, you talked about the capital investment being important, and when I've talked to people in the hydrogen world here in British Columbia, they talk about that capital investment that's needed to create these hubs as being the critical thing they need. That these fairly small companies just don't have the capital themselves. It's difficult for them to get it from within Canada, and that this is the ideal place for the government to really step up and produce that capital infrastructure, produce the infrastructure to help build the hydrogen sector in Canada. Just if you could maybe expand on exactly what that infrastructure, what type of infrastructure is needed here.
I think initially, probably most of the focus, or not, you have to look at the entire value chain, and you have to put the public money and attract private money to support different links in this value chain. And as like any chain, it's only as strong as the weakest link. So one of the weakest links, and the problem is that the vehicles that use hydrogen are right now made in ones or twos. They're not made in tens of thousands like we make diesel vehicles. And so they're very expensive. And so what we're going to need is to create opportunities to support the deployment of these vehicles, initially in demonstrations and small pilots, but eventually in hundreds of buses that would be supporting, say, municipal bus fleets, supporting deployment of large scale hydrogen trucks on major corridors. And I'm talking the very big trucks, the big transport trucks that use a lot of fuel, and the economics of buying these vehicles is very challenging. So the government is going to need to help to support those vehicles until the production level of the vehicles starts to go up and the price will come down. And most of the estimates are within the next 8 to 10 years, we'll be at pretty close to cost parity if we start to really build out lots of these vehicles and have them deployed. But that has to be coordinated with making sure that we have supporting fueling stations. We have to get the infrastructure for ideally pipeline distribution of hydrogen along major corridors. And we have to be focused on where are we trying to be by 2030, 2035, 2040, and start putting that infrastructure in today. The money it's not a lost money. The money from the federal government could be put in a low cost or zero interest loans, and the money will come back to the government as this pipeline starts to get used and we start to develop this new hydrogen economy. And I think those are the kinds of infrastructures that we need to invest in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Canning. So, Mr. Zimmer, over to you for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a question for Dr. Chicart, fellow British Columbian. I'm up in northern BC right now. We certainly like renewables and biofuels, but just am concerned about some of the implications of that. I was on Ag Committee for 4 years prior to this committee, and some of the effects of some of those food crops being turned into fuel crops. What do you say to the potential upward pressure of the the growing renewable fuels as opposed to fuel and its effects on food prices?
Thank you. My point, similar to what I mentioned before, is when we've seen studies that suggest a significant upward movement on food prices, it's been studies that are more of what I called in my remarks all or nothing. So a dramatic movement into biofuels to replace sort of all liquid uses of hydrocarbons, of fossil fuel derived hydrocarbons. And so those are not the studies I'm looking at. Those are not the kind of outcomes that I was talking about in my remarks. I talked more about something like 20%. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Doctor. I know time's tight. So I'll just quote a Bloomberg article from May 20th of 2021. and it talks about the green fuel push stirs food inflation fears and rebound from virus. This is a quote, soaring demand for crops has once again raised the question of whether nations should really depend on ethanol as renewable diesel to save the planet from global warming. Corn, soybeans, palm oil, and sugar, which are increasingly processed into biofuels worldwide, are part of a staggering commodities rally that's making everything from animal feed and noodles to taco shells and chocolate more expensive, putting central bankers worldwide in a tough spot between fighting inflation and seeking to stimulate battered economies. How do you answer that, or how do you speak to that?
It's the same answer. As I said in my opening comments, I've seen studies like that for 25 years. And if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we run scenarios and look at food pricing when we don't take an extreme case like the quote that you were just using from Bloomberg. And so the costs of what food costs is a serious question. And I don't believe, therefore, that biofuels will solve climate, as I think your quote kind of said, that we'll rely on them. It'll be more like insignificant niches, and we've just been here talking about the trucking industry, and that's where we're seeing it happen without those kind of effects.
Right. Well, and maybe I'll open it up to any other witness here. We've seen from the previous Ontario Liberal government, the largest subnational debtor in the world, because mainly to do with their energy policy and sort of just throwing all the money at it. And Doctor, you talked about it. You took, putting money into failures, right? This sort of endless taxpayers' back pocket, and taxpayers only have so much money. So I think this gets to what Mr. McLean was referring to as well. Like we talk about affordability of renewables is a big factor to Canadians. It needs to be affordable, right? And I guess how do you just allay those concerns that this push to biofuels and renewables, I have a quote even that I just wrote down here, we can get to the moon, but at what cost? What cost are we going to get there, I guess? How do we keep those costs? And maybe as a glasses half full kind of guy, how do we get to the moon, but with a low cost?
And I can leave it open for others to comment, because my point was that you use policies that give you the cheapest possible option, and you don't use too much government throwing money at things. So I think my comments have been pretty clear on that point. And so I would argue that any political party that was interested in doing this as inexpensively as possible would agree with the policy recommendations I made in my opening comments. Thanks.
Mr. Lazell?
Yeah, maybe I'm a biologist by trade. Between 1998 and 2008, I set up and ran the BioCap Canada Foundation. It was all about biological solutions to climate change. And I was very supportive of biofuels at that time because they could drop-in fuels, they could result in incremental movement towards a lower carbon energy system. I must say that I am very concerned now. We are talking not about incremental change, we're talking about getting to net zero. I have very grave concerns about biofuels. We don't have enough residual biomass to make the biofuels. So we need to plant and grow biomass, which means there's going to be impacts on biodiversity, it's going to be impacts on food production and land use. And Canada may be able to do it, but the rest of the world can't. We are a country with huge biological resources. So the rest of the world is very clear. They're not looking at biofuels, most of the world. You can pick Finland and a few other countries that maybe are doing it, Sweden. But, and then a real concern is...
Thank you.
Okay.
I have to stop you. Thanks, Mr. Zimmer.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Saray, you're going to be last, and I can probably squeeze out up to 3 minutes for you.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. My first question is to Dr. Lazell. To follow up on my colleague's point, Mr. Wheeler, could you expand on the recommendations for this committee, for the federal government, the decarbonization of buildings? You talked about BC. What are more specific recommendations for buildings and residential houses?
I would argue that at the start we need to test different technologies. We don't have a an economically viable solution today for space heating, which is low carbon. We need to, I would argue that we need to be increasing the carbon taxes on fuels that we use for space heating, but we should be encouraging in regions where it makes sense, heat pumps. Obviously, they have a very efficient and a lot of opportunity, and we can hopefully bring the cost down. But we also need to be looking at putting hydrogen into our natural gas up to maybe 15 or 20%, and using that as moving towards decarbonization. But we also need to be piloting some pure hydrogen heating in our building structures. I think that in the transition pathway we see to a net zero future, the space heating is probably in the 2030s and 2040s. The real focus and opportunity today is in transport and some of the heavier industries, and it's a timing issue.
Thank you, and I don't have much time. I apologize. And you mentioned about increasing the carbon pricing. Mr. Jacquard, talked a bit about that. But Mr. Jacquard, when you talk about regulation, pricing, policies, and moving forward here, I don't, probably have about a minute or so left. But what would be your, kind of recommendations to this committee / to the federal government? Let's say you're a Minister of Finance and you're preparing the budget for 2022. What would be your recommendations to this committee on how to get to, meet our targets?
Offer to the government the suggestion of a rising carbon price or regulations that are just of the kind, if you look through my testimony that I've been talking about, that dominate in California. 85% of their policies are of the kind of regulations I was talking about. So I'm indifferent. You can do regulations so they're about as efficient as carbon pricing. And so that's fine to be indifferent with that, but you do need to regulate or have a rising price, because otherwise fossil fuels are wonderful. They'll destroy the planet, but they're really high quality energy, and also their price is going to fall as we switch away from them. They're going to get even cheaper. So you have to have the regulations and pricing.
Thank you, Mr. Saray.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to stop there. So I will just say thank you to our witnesses. That was a highly interesting panel, but unfortunately we always have a limit on time we can spend on this, but we appreciate it. So for the rest of the committee members, we will suspend. You'll have to log off and log back on into the in-camera session. So thank you again, all.
Thank you.
you.